what fuel do I put in my bike? 98 or 95 or 91? There's so many people out there, bro, to think old motorcycles like this need 98, but the truth of the matter is you're just wasting your money. And you can say whatever you want, but it's the truth, man. This bike is specifically tuned for 95. Are my fork seals done? They are. Well, that's okay. That's good. This bike's specifically tuned for 95. The manual says put 95 in it. The dealership says put 95 in it. The tuner says put 95 in it. If you put 98 in this, bro, you're not going to get more mileage. Your placebo might tell you that you're getting more mileage, but you're not. All you're really doing is wasting your money. And that's going to be super controversial. I'm going to get a lot of comments being like, no, 98, get way more miles on it. Bike runs better, cleaner, lasts longer. It's simply not true. Just put 95 in it. If you have a Grom, I've seen people put 98 in their Groms. If you have a Grom, just put 91 in it, bro. I've had a Grom, ran fine on 91. The manual from Honda says 91, and I think the people that made the bike know the most about it. So read up on your manual, put whatever your manual says in it, and that goes for anything, bro. The oil, the fuel, anything you want to do to your bike, just read the manual first, bro, and just do what they say.